Welcome to Conspiracist. Today we're doing a deep dive into a really compelling hypothesis. The idea that governments have intentionally hidden evidence about the MKUltra mind control program.
It's a complex topic, definitely. The materials we're looking at touch on some documented and frankly disturbing historical events.
Absolutely. And our aim here is to stay strictly professional, really objective. We want to examine the information, the reasoning behind this concealment claim based on the sources.
Okay. Well, the first thing that sort of jumps out is how we even define terms like behavior modification and brainwashing. They're often tangled together, aren't they?
They are. People use them interchangeably sometimes.
Right. But the sources suggest a bit of a difference. Behavior modification is, broader techniques to change actions.
Whereas brainwashing?
Brainwashing, especially back then, during the Cold War fears that kind of fueled MKUltra, it really meant something more like coercive thought control, complete overhaul. And it's interesting, one source mentions a 1956 U.S. Army report. After the Korean War, they looked into it and called brainwashing a, quote, popular misconception.
So even back then, there was some official skepticism about how effective or widespread it really was.
Seems so, at least within that part of the military establishment. But that skepticism didn't stop programs like MKUltra from getting started.
Which brings us to the historical context. MKUltra got the green light in 1953, right?
Correct. Smack in the middle of the Cold War.
And the materials really emphasize this atmosphere of fear, concerns about what the Soviets, the Chinese, North Koreans might be doing with mind control.
Exactly. That anxiety, that perceived threat of an enemy having some kind of psychological weapon seems to have been a huge motivator, a major push.
So it wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. And MKUltra itself, it wasn't just one single thing. The documents show it was more like an umbrella for lots of different sub-projects, different experiments.
Right, that decentralized nature you mentioned, which I suppose could make concealment easier, or harder to track at least.
Potentially, yes. It adds complexity. So when you look at the documented experiments, what really stands out regarding this whole concealment idea?
Well, the repeated use of drugs like LSD, often without any consent whatsoever, that seems central. It's ethically, it's appalling.
It is, and it speaks volumes about the lack of oversight, perhaps.
Definitely. The sources highlight the case of Dr. Frank Olson in '53.
Yeah.
Given LSD without his knowledge, part of a CIA experiment.
And his subsequent death under very questionable circumstances, it's a stark example of the dangers and the secrecy involved.
And it wasn't just rogue actors, was it? The sources point to academic researchers sometimes getting involved.
Yes, and sometimes they might not have even known the full picture, the ultimate goal of how their research might be used.
Like developing techniques that were later adapted for harsh interrogations.
Precisely, which raises serious questions about the lines between academic research and intelligence operations and who is accountable.
Okay, so we had this backdrop of ethically dubious experiments. Let's pivot to the core hypothesis. The intentional concealment of MKUltra evidence. The Church Committee seems vital here.
Absolutely central. Their investigation in the 70s brought a lot of intelligence activities into the light, things that were deeply classified before.
And thousands of pages were eventually declassified, weren't they?
Over 50,000 pages, the sources say. Which sounds like transparency, but...
But the very fact that things were so secret to begin with fuels the idea that maybe not everything came out.
Exactly. It raises the question, what else might still be hidden, especially given what happened to the actual MKUltra file?
The destruction of the records. That's a huge point in the sources.
It is. The Church Committee itself noted this destruction. They stated it made a full understanding, a complete reconstruction of the program, basically impossible.
So regardless of why the records were destroyed, and maybe the intent is debatable, the result was less information, less scrutiny.
Undeniably. And when you place that destruction alongside other historical examples of unethical experiments in the U.S., well, a pattern seems to emerge.
What kind of examples are we talking about?
The materials mention things going way back, like Arthur Wentworth doing spinal taps on kids in 1896 without parental consent.
Wow, okay.
Or Leo Stanley's testicular implant experiments on San Quentin prisoners running for decades from 1913. And Dr. William Black injecting babies with herpes in 1941. Chester Southam injecting cancer cells into prisoners, and even healthy people without their knowledge in the 50s.
So the point isn't that these are the same as MKUltra, but that there's a historical context of unethical research where information wasn't always shared and consent was lacking.
Exactly. It shows a broader pattern where secrecy and ethical breaches occurred, making the idea of concealment around MKUltra perhaps seem more plausible to some.
And the main agency linked to MKUltra itself in these sources is consistently the CIA.
Yes, their involvement is very clear from the documentation.
And thinking about where this stuff might have happened, facilities like Fort Detrick come up, not necessarily directly linked to every MKUltra subproject in these specific materials, but it represents that kind of secure, sensitive government research site.
Right. It gives you a sense of the environment. Fort Detrick had its own history with biological research, so it exemplifies the kind of place where highly classified sensitive work could be conducted away from public view.
The sources also draw a line, perhaps not direct, but a connection between some earlier research funded by the CIA and later practices.
You mean the link to the enhanced interrogation techniques?
Yes, the ones used between 2002 and 2007. The idea that CIA-funded research contributed to those methods.
That's suggested in the materials. It doesn't mean MKUltra directly created those specific techniques, but it points to a persistent interest within intelligence circles in influencing human behavior, sometimes through very harsh means.
And this fits into a broader picture painted by the sources of documented CIA human rights violations, right?
Yeah.
Things like torture, black sites.
Yes, that documented history provides a context of secrecy, questionable ethics, and operating outside normal legal frameworks. Against that backdrop, the hypothesis of hiding past controversial programs like MKUltra gains a certain resonance.
It's also worth noting, just for wider context, that the sources briefly mention other countries engaging in secret, unethical research.
Right, like the Soviet poison labs and their human experiments.
And the horrific Unit 731 experiments in Japan during World War II.
These examples show that the U.S. wasn't unique in governments conducting secret, ethically abominable research. It doesn't excuse anything, but it provides a global context for these kinds of activities.
Shifting back to the U.S., the whole idea of brainwashing did enter public consciousness, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The sources mention legal cases.
Yes, defenses raised in cases like Patty Hearst or Charles Manson. It shows the concept, however accurate or inaccurate, was definitely out there in the public mind and even in courtrooms.
Even while, as we said earlier, the Army itself had expressed skepticism years before.
A fascinating contrast, really.
So pulling all this together from the materials, we have MKUltra, a documented program with unethical experiments. We have the destruction of key records. We have a history of other unethical experiments and a context of intelligence agency secrecy and human rights issues.
It lays a foundation for asking the question about concealment.
Exactly. The sources provide reasons why someone might hypothesize intentional concealment. But it is crucial, isn't it, to stress that the materials don't offer definitive proof of a current, ongoing, large-scale cover-up of all MKUltra evidence.
That's a critical distinction. The record destruction is factual. The intent behind it, and whether concealment continues actively today, that remains, based on these sources, part of the hypothesis itself, not a proven fact.
So the evidence points to secrecy, lost records, and questionable past actions, which fuels the theory.
Yes, and it leaves us with a significant question, really. Given this history, the documented unethical acts, the secrecy, the destroyed files, what does this tell us about government transparency and the ethical guardrails needed for sensitive research?
That seems like a key takeaway, regardless of whether you fully subscribe to the ongoing concealment hypothesis. The history itself raises fundamental issues.
Precisely. The documented past demands scrutiny and raises questions about accountability that are relevant today.
We have explored the hypothesis that evidence of the MKUltra mind control program has been intentionally concealed by governments, drawing on the information provided in the sources. We've looked at the historical setting, the disturbing experiments, the crucial destruction of records, and the wider context of intelligence activities and ethical lapses.
The question of intentional, ongoing concealment, as we've discussed, remains complex. It's something that invites continued examination of historical records and pushes for greater government transparency.
It certainly is a lot to think about. Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.